on what we should be reflecting upon tonight. And I'm not going to be doing that introduction myself this evening. I'd like to call upon the Deputy President of the BMF, Ms. Tasneem Fredericks. Over to you.
Good evening, Bongiwe. Thank you very much. Before I begin with this next important item that I am so privileged and honored to be doing this evening on this most esteemed and high platform, I'd like to wish His Excellency, the former President Kgalema Motlanthe, a very good evening, a warm evening to him. Mr. President, thank you for being here this evening, and thank you for gracing us with your presence. I also would like to acknowledge and greet Prof. Nkulu, the BMF President Andile Nomlala, our very valued partner from PwC, Ms. Shirley. Always nice to see her, always nice to see her consistent support for the BMF through, whether it be through the trust or other initiatives. And then I think importantly, the reason why we are here, the Lot Ndlovu family who have joined us this evening. And I'd also like to convey our sincere condolences as the BMF. We understand that there was a passing of a very close family member. So may God give you strength and patience during your time of sorrow. I'd then also like to obviously welcome and greet the BMF board members, BMF members, and also BMF stalwarts, past presidents and deputy presidents, as well as the audience this evening for joining us. They say that great leaders show their greatness through action and not through words. So really, this evening when I do my introduction, I must warn the audience and my colleagues that this is really an abbreviated bio of His Excellency, the former President. I'm sure that if, this was, a real introduction with all the accomplishments, we'd at least need an hour. But it just shows the humility that such great leaders have. And if I can just start the introduction by saying that, Mr. President, you worked for the Johannesburg City Council in the 1970s, possibly in management, what BMF stands for. You were recruited by Umkhonto weSizwe, the then armed wing of the ANC. And then after 11 months detention in John Vorster Square police station in central Johannesburg, you were sentenced to an effective 10 years imprisonment in 1977, which you served on Robben Island. What a huge sacrifice for everybody in South Africa, and such an honor to have you here to be able to thank you for your time that nobody can ever replace away from your family in isolation in Robben Island. And then obviously being released in 1987, you were tasked with strengthening the trade union movement while working for NUM, National Union of Mine Workers. In 1992, you were then elected as NUM's General Secretary and responsible for establishment of the Mine Workers Investment Company, the Mine Workers Development Agency, as well as the JB Marks Education Fund, which focused on the developmental needs of ex-mine workers, their dependents and communities. You served 2 5-year terms as Secretary General of the ANC. You were President of the Republic of South Africa in September 2008 to May 2009, during which time you joined world leaders at G20 summits and other multilateral bodies to really respond to the global financial crisis that we've been talking about and hearing about. And then back in South Africa, you worked with business, labor, and civil society to minimize the impact of the crisis on the South African economy. I must tell you, Mr. President, that as BMF, we've made extensive input into the national minimum wage. So when it was introduced by legislation, we were one of the parties that made that input, and we were quite excited and happy that it was implemented as legislation. And I think implementation is ongoing. We're never going to, and I think the start at the basis of this great democracy that you personally fought for in liberating all South Africans was to have this excellent pieces of legislation as a starting point. And so our progeny, our children and great-grandchildren who come after us will still be, eating of the fruits of your and other revolutionaries, your labor and your sacrifice. You were then appointed by the Deputy President, Jacob Zuma, President Zuma, who held, you were appointed by President Zuma as the Deputy President and held this position until May 2014. You now head your own foundation, the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation, which you've been established and which you still run. I just want to conclude with the words of Lot Ndlovu in his book, Lot Speaks, where Lot says, and I paraphrase, South Africa not only belongs to those who live in it, but I think more importantly to those who love it. So in those words, President Kgalema, we hand over to you and we wait with bated breath to hear these pearls of wisdom that we are sure you're going to be dispensed. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
There we are. Thank you very much, Tasneem Fredericks, for your warm words of welcome and introduction. I've had the dubious honor of having to listen to my obituary being read, under pretext of being introduced. So I thank you for your brief, benign introduction. Program Director, Ms. Bongiwe Zwani, Monde Ndlovu and the Ndlovu family, the chairman of Maduke Lot Ndlovu Legacy Trust, Professor Wiseman Kutlu, the president of Black Management Forum, Mr. Andile Nomlala, the CEO of PwC Southern Africa, Ms. Shelley Machaba. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I thank the Maduke Lot Ndlovu Legacy Trust and the Black Management Forum for inviting me to deliver this annual lecture on the life and times of Lot Ndlovu. This is a singular honor and privilege for me to address you in memoriam of our leader, brother, and comrade, Lot Ndlovu. Lot Ndlovu, whom we remember, celebrate, and draw lessons from at this annual lecture, was a universal man with a benevolence as expansive as the cosmos. He was a free thinker, skilled in various disciplines, who was as comfortable talking about hard numbers in the bottom line as he was about conversing in matters of philosophy and sociology. His warm heart and curious mind created a space and an environment conducive to wide-ranging knowledge in many fields. His was a spirit that referred to human beings collectively, a compassionate and humane totality that brought about fundamental solutions to the problems of the day. As we understand it, the universe itself is an aggregate of all things, the totality of everything across space, including the earth itself. But when considering what it is that allows for habitable conditions for plants and animals, we are given the opportunity to discover the natural phenomena of the world. A complex combination of air, water, and soil, elements that blend and brew to imbue a primordial soup in a delicate balance that allows for life on Earth. Such phenomena is well articulated by Gordon Childe in his seminal book entitled Man Makes Himself in the following words, and I quote, "Man's emergence on Earth is indicated to the archaeologists by the tools he made. Man needs tools to supplement the deficiencies of his physiological equipment for securing food and shelter. He is enabled to make them by the delicate correlation of hand and eye, rendered possible by the constitution of his brain and nervous system," close quote. In simple terms, the integrated survival and development of society is a function of securing food and shelter by acting upon nature. Arguably, this is the essence of the creation and evolution of technology for productive economic activity.
Do stay with Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. We'll be going back to the Lot Ndlovu Lecture in just a moment.
Lot Ndlovu, whose valuable and outstanding contributions to the organization brought about a focused confidence and determination to achieve broad and meaningful change. Understanding the influence and impression that the private sector has to play in effecting societal change is a notion that Lot Ndlovu succinctly captures as being at once an individual and collective responsibility. In his own words, Lot Ndlovu said, and I quote, "The connection is critical in that the influence that business has on the lives of the community is overwhelming. And so those whose hands are on the levers of power in businesses ought to tremble each time they exercise their responsibility, because what they do now affects eventually the community out there," close quote. And it is the community out there that in turn affects the economic structure of society. Through our lived experience on the ground, we observe how the material conditions determine our consciousness. This leads to the understanding that communities are inspired by different pressures and objectives, both in our recent past and present. The historical context we refer here covers the era of apartheid with its racially based discrimination that penetrated all facets of life, as well as the corollary struggle for a humane socio-economic system. Repression opposed by resistance, fascist brutality opposed by fierce determination and resilience, white supremacy opposed by the just cause for freedom. Something was boiling beneath the surface. A disorder of famine and hardship, burning like lava and pushing through cracks and fissures of the bedrock of South Africa. An urgent sense of uneasy impatience, fueled by a latent panic that underpinned the doubt, despair, and distress of millions of people. Simmering with a toxic mix of economic, political, and social discontent, the mountain of struggle exploded into protests that spewed massive columns of anti-establishment smoke and ash across the skies of South Africa. Protesters looking for food and freedom, police shooting at youth, the blood of the poor shed, an outpouring of public anger, the fingers of perceived corruption pointed in every direction, international criticism, a call for lasting change and reforms promised. And that was on the eve of the democratic dispensation in 1994. The volcanic activities leading up to 1994 were in the pursuit of a just and noble cause, whereas the recent happenings of last month were but mere riots. And in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I quote, "The limitation of riots, moral questions aside, is that they cannot win and their participants know it. Hence, rioting is not revolutionary but reactionary because it invites defeat. It involves an emotional catharsis, but it must be followed by a sense of futility," close quote. We are told that tensions are beginning to die down and that the aftermath of mass unrest, the country faces new concerns, namely a disaster management program and a fiscal meltdown that will no doubt have further ramifications on the poorest members of society. However, it is important for us to remember that the tensions are still incredibly high and at a boiling point. The tension of a mother unable to feed her family, the tension of millions of young men and women unable to find a job, the tension of business owners wading through the mud of the country in junk status, the tension of a child unable to access an education and the internet, the tension of political mistrust, the tension of gender-based violence lurking around every corner, the tension of food insecurity, and the tension of humanity facing a global pandemic, to name but a few. These tensions are not beginning to die down. On the contrary, they are only rising. The need for survival of families, further exacerbated by rising poverty and agitated by the grief of COVID-19, has fueled this ongoing sense of rage below the surface. But the accidents of history are sometimes not accidental at all. And it is crucial that we pause, take a step back, and look at the bigger picture. By doing this, we give ourselves the space to ask some pertinent questions on what has changed South Africa in ways that we can learn from. The Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections recent summit on the Ndlulamity scenarios and economic modeling offers some scientific insight into the lived experience of South Africans through research and quantified data to understand what needs to be done to save South Africa's people from injustices. The scenarios paint a picture of a pre-COVID South Africa that was already in precarious circumstances, accompanied by job losses and the anticipation of further economic decline that was already entrenched in the psyche of the nation. While the current global focus is on recovering from COVID-19, the studies show that South Africa has neglected some of its existing threats and solutions, and one such oversight is the influence of the private sector on the recovery and healing process of the country. As the compound effect of multiple crises gush onto the harsh historic weaknesses, the promise of nation building and inclusive economic growth become somewhat out of reach. The people of South Africa are being continually inflicted by the pangs of poverty, which are exacerbated by rampant corruption, seemingly with no consequences for the culprits. So, What is this subterranean tyranny on the people of South Africa? A cruelty of seismic proportions that seems to endure through the ages and now coupled with crises that widen underlying fault lines. All of these calamities were matched by fierce determination to usher in democracy. Program Director, we now all enjoy universal suffrage and are in the course of building a united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, and a prosperous South Africa. We call upon all those in positions of power to pledge their help and active citizenship as a symbol of renewal, to embrace a South African identity that promotes social cohesion, democracy, and human rights, to advance economic transformation and participation of the people. However, the absence of national discourse around our humanitarian heritage robs us of realizing the values that are enshrined in our Constitution, values and ethics that guide us when we struggle to find good leadership, values that we uphold in the knowledge that only through united and concerted effort can we prosper. If we adopt a historical approach in our work, we no doubt notice how this timeline highlights the persistence of inequality, revealing dimensions of ongoing economic and exploitative imbalances. And by assessing our past and its reflection on our present, we also examine our conscience and the efforts we have made or not made as leaders to foster equitable and inclusive growth in the lives of all people. Despite the progress made in the era of democracy, what progress has been made in understanding why a lack of economic transformation has persisted and even escalated since 1994. This continuum of poverty and lack of entrepreneurial access to capital is a glaring expression of our failures as leaders. And in the words of James Baldwin, and I quote, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are history. If we pretend otherwise, we literally are criminals," close quote. With the words of James Baldwin's encouragement, let us go back in time for a moment and explore the lessons of our history. But how do we understand this perpetual violence, the exploitative nature of capitalism and corruption, the racial exclusion and ongoing economic inequality experienced by the majority? Kgalema Lot Ndlovu, we recognize that his contributions open a window to the history and accomplishments of economic transformation in South Africa. This window offers us a viewpoint to commemorate and appreciate the lineage of Black citizens and freedom fighters who struggled and contributed to the development of economic empowerment within our democracy. It thus remains important for us to reflect on the perspective of equal economic participation over the past 3 decades. Collectively, we need to identify the obstacles that continue to restrict the effective and sustainable implementation of inclusive growth and equitable distribution of wealth. As leaders, we hope to make sense of the long distance ahead in achieving progress. It is through dialogue and platforms such as BMF's Annual Lot Ndlovu Lecture, where the private sector, public sector, and civil society are offered important opportunities to map out a future. These discussions allow us to test the application of these policies and further drive the agenda of transformation on an evolving basis. Championing economic empowerment in South Africa is significant in its strength to contribute towards realizing the macro vision of equitable and inclusive growth. Tackling the widespread concern about the scale and consequences of inequality and addressing the failure of economic growth at a grassroots level are the touch points to engage in this forum. When considering the milestones on this complicated path, it must be recognized that in order to achieve anything of significance, people should come first. This is a principle that Lot Ndlovu championed for employers, employees, young entrepreneurs, and all stakeholders. People should not be left out, marginalized, or unheard. People do not only have concerns, complaints, and requests, but they also have suggestions. They need to be heard and considered. Lot Ndlovu was cognizant of the value of listening and giving a voice to those who are often unheard. In his sensitivity to the entire business supply chain, as well as the end user, Lot Ndlovu understood the importance of reflection and analysis to learn the lessons needed to improve business practice in the quest to strengthen social cohesion. Acknowledging the weaknesses of business policy are small steps towards sustaining a constitutional democracy. Lot Ndlovu was a leader who took giant steps in this regard. However, the market price of lessons learned by the public sector and private sector are open to debate. How far the needle has moved in the economic landscape is a cost to the poorest, with an expenditure sheet that lists the expenses of the monopolistic tendencies of even the most altruistic businessmen. A yawning gap to traverse and the mounting impatience with rising unemployment and worsening income inequality sometimes obscures our vision of the pathway forward. Understanding Lot Ndlovu's trajectory is to appreciate his context. Like his colleagues and peers, and like all of us, Lot Ndlovu is at once a product and creator of history, a child of his environment that shaped his impulse, responses, and reactions. South Africa was and is a country that faces a constant crisis of leadership. And it is within these ethical crises that Lot Ndlovu's model of leadership shone bright. His was a model of contextual leadership. He had the humility to accept that perhaps for far too long we may have been wrong in how we measure and prescribe leadership. His honesty exposed that it is not merely one's attributes that makes one a successful leader. Rather, he understood leadership as an instrument to create a context in which others are enabled to succeed. To him, true leadership was an expression of empathy, integrity, and morality, where he became what his team and the people of South Africa needed him to be at the time. To ignore context is to ignore the data and hence the truth. And the glaring question that then stares us all in the face is, are we the leader that our team and our country need us to be at this time? Some may say that there is no way of effectively quantifying context, but luckily for South Africa, we have a guidebook that evaluates the steadiness of the hand of those in power. Tremble not some may tell you, but at your own peril, our leader, Lot Ndlovu, would certainly assert. For society to collectively steer through uncertain times, we rely on an ability to navigate with a moral compass that encourages public service and civic responsibility as fundamental building blocks for socio-economic cohesion, human development, and a robust, inclusive future. Through the BMF and similar platforms for dialogue and change, individuals and communities are given a chance to embody the values and spirit of Mabuza, Don Mkwanazi, Eric Mafuna, Beki Sibia, Ruel Koza, J.B. Magwaza, Don Ngube, Fred Paswana, Gibson Tula, Nolita Fakude, and their peers. Theirs is a mirror through which we must reflect ourselves, draw our inspiration and moral ascendancy. They breathed life into and walked the values of our Constitution. The principles within our Constitution are therefore sacred. They underpin the social values that leaders such as Lot Ndlovu lived by and serve as a guide to an individual's actions, beliefs, and emotional system. To quantify context is to appreciate that an individual cannot be separated from the broad society she or he is a part of. We see ourselves in each other through shared values. They bring legitimacy to the rules and laws that govern us. They are the essence of what it takes to create social cohesion and an inclusive future. Returning to the sirens of danger beneath the surface, alarming us to the constant threats that the people face, these warning signs ask us to examine the unfulfilled promise of freedom through the prism of social, economic, and political decay. Against this suffering, we are reminded now in Women's Month, more than ever, that gender discrimination deepens the roots of impoverishment, which imposes a disproportionate burden on women. While both men and women suffer in poverty, gender discrimination means that women have far fewer resources to cope, are likely the last to eat, and the least likely to access education, health care, equal pay, and the respect that they deserve. What must be highlighted, amplified, and placed at the center of discussions at the Black Management Forum and across society is the fact that having more women in leadership positions could set South Africa, and indeed the world, on a more sustainable path. Women have proven to be leading the way towards more equitable and sustainable solutions to climate change. Women tend to share more information about community well-being and are more willing to adapt to environmental changes as their family lives are impacted, and women often take the first step in recognizing the power they have to effect change through their roles, not only in business, but also in their homes, communities, government, and environment. Contextual leadership is very much the domain of women. By bringing gender equality to business management positions, grows the country's economy and creates new vistas of opportunities through equal pay and safe spaces for women in the workplace to boost the private sector and advance the potential for prosperity. Sensitive to the time we are in and the kind of leadership that the country needs, Lord Ndlovu's conviction would echo the sentiments of Women's Month and the need for women to lead from the front. Using one's privilege as a leader and in business is a lesson to be learned on moderating our egos and conceit, undermining our weaknesses, and reinforcing our strengths. It is of our peers and mentors that we must ask the most difficult questions. What Lord Ndlovu taught us is that he was never a man who asked of others what he was not prepared to undertake himself. And so it is in his spirit and in the heart of the BMF that we should all ask ourselves the following question. What are we prepared to do to achieve good for all people, and how do we close the gap between our social values, our actions, and beyond? As I conclude, allow me, Program Director, to leave you with the refrain from the lyrics of Desiderata, which reportedly was found in Old St. Paul's Church in Baltimore, dated 1692. And I quote, "Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here," close quote. That was the Lord Ndlovu we knew and so revered, a man that belonged to the universe and who did not need validation, for he knew that he belonged. And I thank you for your attention and refer back to our Program Director. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. President. That really left us with quite a lot to ponder this evening as we really reflect on the life of this free thinker, as you've described him, a skilled in various disciplines, warm-hearted, curious mind. His was a spirit that reflected human beings collectively. I'm borrowing from some of what you've said to us tonight and really just getting us to think long and hard about where everything is and where the country is finding itself at the moment. And what you also reflected on is the importance of these three scenarios that we've seen being painted by Indlulamiti, the Kwarakwaras, a floundering false dawn, which is where we are finding ourselves and hoping to at some point get to a nation that is in step with itself in Naile Walk. And thank you so much for really just helping us to reflect on where South Africa is and answering the critical question of social cohesion and whether or not it is to be attainable by 2030, as you talk about those then who are still going to bed hungry, who are still trying themselves to be able to be part of this dynamic economy that Lord Ndlovu would have fought for and even hoping for this nation to then achieve. I'd like them to call on somebody who tells